Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And we are super excited to have with us today University of New England President, Dr. James Herbert. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you're lucky enough to know that we're actually in his office overlooking the mouth of the Saco River.
It's pretty, I pinch myself that I get to have this as my office. So it's a pretty special place. I'm very, very humbled and honored to be able to call this place home.
It is spectacular. Oftentimes I'll come up with a one-word description for a guest, and yours, James, would be electric.
As in like electric vehicles, charge them up kind of thing? Or
as in energy.
Oh.
Energy. You are just a man full of good and positive energy.
Oh, that's very kind.
Recognize that immediately when meeting you and working with you. It's been a real pleasure.
That's really kind, Rick. I appreciate that. And the feeling is very much mutual. I had a great sense, a great vibe from you from the moment we met, and we've become friends, and I appreciate that. But yeah, you're not the first person that's told me that I have a high energy level. I guess that's a good thing. I don't know.
Well, the great thing is I was mentioning to Holly before we got started, your assistant, that your energy, your electricity is matched with a great layer of affirmation and gratefulness towards people that you're with. Yes.
That's so kind.
It's an uncommon combination.
Well, I really appreciate that. It's a long story. I come from pretty humble background, and so I feel just very, very honored and privileged to be in the position that I'm in today. I still sometimes, I'm a first generation college student. I grew up in a blue collar home, blue collar neighborhood, and so I just feel very honored. I don't take for granted the privileges and things that I have. And so it keeps me humble.
Wonderful. Today's conversation is going to be, our topic is a provocative conversation about your recent president's forum, that was entitled, Our Colleges and Universities Too Liberal, which really was last night, but by the time this airs, it will be a couple of weeks. But I look forward to discussing that. But I wanted to give the folks out there that are listening a little bit of an introduction on you, Dr. Herbert, president of the University of New England since 2017. And you've led the university in developing and executing a strategic plan that I understand goes out to 2029. Mm-hmm. And your mission is to enhance the health of individuals, communities, and the natural world. And during your tenure, you've overseen growth in academic, research, athletic programs, new facilities, and strategic external partnerships. You are an advocate for the transformational marriage of active classroom instruction with experiential learning. You've overseen curricular and, help me with this word,
pedagogical.
Yeah. I am at school. Innovations to prepare students for success through the acquisition of deep disciplinary knowledge, essential life skills, and critical habits of mind. Prior to UNE, you served as Dean of the Graduate College at Drexel University, also served there as interim provost, and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, head of the Department of Psychology, and president of the university faculty. You're an internationally recognized expert in psychology, particularly in the treatment of mood and anxiety disorders, and widely known for your work on combating pseudoscience in mental health. Your scholarly contributions include over 170 publications, and your book, Acceptance and Mindfulness in Cognitive Behavior Therapy, received endorsement from the Dalai Lama for its impactful approach to mental well-being. You hold a PhD and an MA in clinical psychology from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and a BA in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. You are married to Lynn Brandsma,
yeah.
I read that wrong. Psychologist and professor, 4 grown children. James, thank you for being here.
It's such a pleasure. And now you've embarrassed me with such a nice introduction.
Well, I know there's a lot that's missing too.
No, that's very kind.
Yes.
And it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, great. So let's talk about the forum.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can introduce a little bit of the background of how it came about.
Sure.
And the topic and
so what I guess to back up one step, if possible, it's the President's Forum is one program within a larger initiative that we call the Marketplace of Ideas. So, and we started that the year after I got here, or really the first year I was here. So in 2018, we started that larger program, the Marketplace of Ideas. And what motivated it was the higher ed, universities really should be places where we talk about the most important and the most controversial topics of the day. And we debate them in a civil, thoughtful, respectful way, but have robust conversations, no holds barred, where we really, have those hard conversations. So, the old saying about the things your parents tell you you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, right? What is it? Religion, sex,
politics.
It's politics. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, those are precisely the things we ought to be talking about, right? At universities, this is the place we should be talking, debating, but in a way that's respectful. And what I've noticed really over the course of my career, but especially in the past, let's say 10 to 15 years, is that those conversations became harder and harder to have on college campuses because people became afraid of saying the wrong thing, getting canceled. And we can talk a lot about where this comes from. Part of it is social media and the power of social media to censor what people say. A lot of it comes from good intentions to try to create spaces that people can feel more comfortable, especially people who have traditionally been underrepresented in universities. And so there's some good intentions, but the problem with those good intentions, like many things, sometimes good intentions can go awry. And it created an environment that was quite stifling. And this isn't just me saying this. There's lots of surveys that show that students feel that they self-censor. They're afraid of talking about things that might possibly cause offense for fear that they might offend the person, that they themselves will get canceled somehow. So this really just kept getting worse and worse and worse to the point that if a speaker came to campus who had a view that wasn't part of the generally accepted orthodoxy of belief on campus, they would get shouted down, they'd get booed, they'd literally, in some cases, get run off the campus. There's many instances. I did a TED Talk a few years ago where I highlighted one of these instances at an elite liberal arts college where the speaker and the guest, the professor who had invited the speaker or who was moderating the conversation, were physically attacked by the mob. So this is just appalling to me, right? We should be having these conversations. And so I was trying to create a culture at UNE that encouraged such conversations and not running away from these hard questions, but actually having the conversations. And importantly, well, let me back up. So the President's Forum is one piece of that larger thing. I believe what you need to have to achieve a true marketplace of ideas is you need academic freedom, free speech. People need to be able to say what's on their mind. You need diversity of thought. If everybody thinks the same way, shares the same biases, the same political starting point and orientation, then even if you have freedom of thought, you're only going to hear one side of the story, right? If you and I already agree on something, it's not that interesting just to say, okay,
we
agree.
Something else.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the second thing you need. And then you need an environment that even if people are free technically to say what they want to say, that is sufficiently respectful and civil, right? That it encourages productive dialogue. Because imagine you have the first two things, but without the third, meaning you have freedom of speech. Okay, check, we got that. We have diversity of thought. So two people who have very different perspectives on an issue, but we don't do it in a respectful way. So we just scream at each other and call each other names, right? Well, that's not very productive. So if you're missing any one of those three elements, you're not going to have a productive marketplace of ideas. And most universities, frankly, are missing all three of them to one degree or another. So I set out to make that one of my pet projects here. And a signature part of that, it's not the only part of that marketplace of ideas, but a signature piece of that is this President's Forum that you were referring to. And basically what that is And we're still experimenting with it, figuring out exactly how to refine it, get it right. But the basic idea is we pick a topic that is a hot button topic that most places, most people are not talking about for fear of, or if they're talking about it, they only talk about it with people that agree with them, but they're not really exploring it. Things like gun control or abortion or, probably the hottest one we did was right at the time when, I don't know if you remember the Leah Thomas, the swimmer from Penn, the
Yes.
competitive swimmer, who was a biological male who transitioned to become a trans woman, but then was competing on the women's sports teams, the swim team, and was winning all the records and everything. And so that created a lot of controversy, right? It was a very hot topic. And, so we decided, well, let's do it. Let's talk about, should biological men, trans women, be allowed to participate to compete on women's sports teams? And as you can imagine, very different opinions on that. And this was right when Leah Thomas was all in the news and everything. And we bring in 2 or more speakers from different sides of the question. So in that case, we had a trans woman who was very much an advocate for trans women being able to participate side by side with other women. And then we had a professor from Harvard who had just written a book on testosterone, who argued that no, men and women, biological men and women, are actually different in important ways when it comes to strength and speed. In many cases, most cases, trans women should not be participating on women's sports teams. And so we brought them together. So my staff actually thought I'd kind of lost my mind on that when they said, okay, now you've gone too far. This is a bad idea. This is not going to go well, right?
Dr. James Herbert in full voltage.
There you go. But I'm like, no, this is the whole point. We need to be having that conversation because people are not talking about this. And so we did, and it went great. The 2 women met, they talked. It was a moderated conversation. And by the way, the idea here is not a formal debate. It's not like an Oxford style debate. It's a conversation. And it went great. And afterwards, right after it was over, they were still on the stage. The professor from Harvard, she looked at me and she said, we could never have done this at Harvard. She said, we would have been shut down within 30 seconds of even trying to have this conversation. And so
shut down from
the students. The community would have, because the prevailing view is that there is a right answer to this question. And in the case of most universities, which tend to lean left politically, the right answer is that, of course, trans women are absolutely women in every respect, and they ought to be able to participate. End of story. And if you think otherwise, you're a bigot, right? You're a sexist bigot. And that's the prevailing view. And it lacks nuance. It's just black or white, And so consequently, if you have someone who's trying to make the case that actually, no, it's more complicated than that, and you can still respect trans women, right? We're not saying, or I'm not taking a side either way here. I'm just trying to provide the platform to have the conversation. But the professor from Harvard, for example, that side is not saying that trans people don't exist, not saying they shouldn't be able to live their life as they see fit, but that this narrow question of competing on women's sports teams, maybe that's not a good idea. We ought to look at that. So the whole idea is to explore these issues in their nuances, in the gray areas, right? And so that's what we did in that one. And that exemplifies what we're trying to do is really dive right into the most controversial topics, hear from different sides on it, with 2 purposes in mind. The first is to do a deep dive into that topic to really understand the issue and all its complexity. But the other is to model for our students, and frankly, for the larger community, how to have those conversations so that you can have someone who you disagree with and know how in the classroom, outside the classroom, in real life, to be able to have a conversation respectfully and not devolve into name calling and finger pointing. And so, yeah, that's the basic program.
Great.
The idea.
Yeah. And the most recent one was on the topic of colleges and universities.
Exactly. So it's actually an interesting thing. It's sort of turning the lens of this whole forum inward onto the university itself and saying, are we biased? And if so, is that a problem? And what motivated that question is, again, if you look at, there's data on this. If you survey faculty and if you survey professional staff at the university, non-faculty employees, what you find is the vast majority describe themselves as politically progressive in one form or another. They vote Democratic, they're registered Democrats. And it's been that way for a long time, but it's gotten much more so. And that's especially true in social science and humanities departments. And it's especially true in New England. So in fact, and surveys in New England show that outside of business schools, only 1 in 28 faculty members describe themselves as conservative. So that's 27 out of 28 describe themselves as politically liberal. So that's just a fact. It is just a fact that staff and faculty tend to be politically left-leaning. So the question becomes, is that a problem, right? So the Republicans, the political right, have been arguing more and more that it very much is a problem, because the universities are these ideological monocultures where, strict adherence to a certain way of thinking is enforced. This is the narrative from the right. And the left says, no, that's not the case at all. Yes, there may be more faculty who are politically liberal, but they challenge the idea that impacts students. And there's data suggesting that students don't really change their political views that much in college after all. Students who come from conservative backgrounds, they tend to graduate conservative as well. So that's one argument that this isn't a problem. Another interesting argument is that some progressively leaning faculty say that it's natural because universities are places of innovation. They're places where you challenge the status quo, right? They're not just places where you just keep doing what we've always been doing. They're supposed to be places of innovation, and that liberals tend to be, or progressives tend to be, more inclined towards challenging the status quo, thinking about new ways of doing things relative to conservatives. Now, I'm not saying I endorse that view. I'm just trying to lay out what the arguments are. So the question is it a problem or not? So what we did last night is we had 4 people, 2 on one side of that question, 2 on the other, to have a conversation and try to hash through that. And it was an interesting conversation. Unfortunately, being that we are in Maine, we had an ice storm. Snow's no problem. Had it just been snow, it would have been fine. But we had an ice storm, which caused us to have to move the event at the last minute onto Zoom. And then we had some technical glitches. And so it was okay. It went well, but they go better in person because you get that, personal dynamic. So,
well, it was a great discussion. It was a really great discussion. And to hear the different points of view and not knowing, completely an outsider.
Yeah.
Not knowing who was who.
Yeah.
To be able to sort of, it didn't become immediately apparent, but you could see towards the end which direction it was going in.
Yeah.
But fascinating to hear their responses and the dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. So, one important question that came up last night, I think, that was fascinating is it possible, is the solution to having a more open, robust discourse on campus, do you necessarily have to have more people from conservative backgrounds to sort of balance it out, right? I mean, that's one possibility. But is it possible that someone, even if you are very politically progressive, that you can nevertheless present both sides of the story in a fair way, right? So let's take something like tariffs, right? So Trump is in the news right now with all of his tariffs, which is sort of interesting because, by the way, until yesterday, it was, to the extent that people were promoting tariffs, it was the left that liked tariffs and the right that didn't like free trade. Now it's suddenly flipped, right? Like so many of these things, it's like, wait, what's going on? But so set aside Trump and let's just consider the question of tariffs, right? So whatever your position, if you are teaching a class in macroeconomics or something, in my perspective, regardless of your personal politics, you should do your best to give the arguments for why tariffs are important, or, the people who advocate for them, and then also the arguments against them, right?
Sure.
And to give the best argument possible. Now, what unfortunately often happens is people will say, okay, I'll present both sides of it. They'll present their side, the side that they believe in, that resonates with them, in a very robust, full-throated way. And the other side kind of create a straw man, right? There's a term, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, called steel manning. Instead of straw manning, it's a steel man. And to steel man an argument means, let's say you and I disagree about something, and I should be able to present your argument in its best possible light, not just create a straw man of your argument. So the argument that I disagree with, the position I disagree with, to steel man it means to present it in its strongest form, even stronger than the way you presented it. You see what I'm saying?
I do.
And so that's the challenge. And that's what I think the challenge for professors. So an interesting question becomes, how well can people do that for views that they don't agree with? So if you asked me to articulate the argument that goes against something I believe, can I do that really well? Right? Can I really present a strong, really strong, good, fair argument for that position?
And that question would work for any individual, but
exactly.
In the academic setting, the expectation would be that a professor would be more prepared for that.
Well,
correct?
that's the expectation. That's the hope.
Right.
And I think faculty are, although it's an open question. The panel last night, a couple of the professors were saying, no, we already do this. We're good. We got this. This is, all faculty do this. I'm not convinced. I think many do. They do a really good job of presenting issues in a fair, a balanced way, controversial issues. But I don't think that all faculty do. In fact, I think a lot of faculty missed the mark on that and could do better. And not just faculty. I'm not picking on faculty, all of us, but we're just focused on faculty because they're the ones in the room.
Of the students.
Right.
So thinking about this, you said, is it 25 would categorize themselves as progressive liberal?
So in New England, right? It's greater in New England because we're a more liberal part of the country. It's 1 in 28 or 27 and 28 consider themselves liberal.
Which that's how they would classify themselves, let's say. It doesn't mean that's how they teach.
Exactly.
I'm going to throw out a little my own Rick Bisson philosophy here.
Please, yeah.
I look at what the 1% in our population has for influence these days. And is it only 1% or some smaller percentage, I guess is the point, of faculty that are causing this wave of sense that there's this liberal overtone?
No, I think you raise a really good point. And I would say not only is it a smaller but disproportionately loud group of faculty, but the same thing with students, right? So, and an even broader thing is the same with institutions. So if you think about who was in the news over, pick your issue, even the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protests of last year, it was primarily, not exclusively, but primarily the Ivy League and the elite liberal arts colleges, right? Those places educate around 1% of American students, college students, higher ed. So it's a small group relative to the rest of us who educate the majority of students, where that level of activism is not nearly as strong. So I think you're right. I think it's a minority of institutions that get disproportionate attention. There's an old saying within higher ed that when Harvard sneezes, the rest of us catch a cold. So, everybody's got their eyes on Harvard and any little thing that happens at Harvard. And by the way, I have some colleagues at Harvard, and when I talk to them, they'll say, yeah, they don't actually welcome this scrutiny either, because there are people watching every little thing and, they're under an intense spotlight. But there's a tendency to generalize to all of higher ed and talk about college campuses, as being these intolerant places where nobody can, and that's just really not accurate. Most college campuses are not like that, and most faculty are not like that. But I don't want to, at the same time, I don't want to gloss over the problem, because it is a problem that it's much easier to hold certain views on college campuses in general than it is others. I mentioned the trans issue is just one example, but there are many others. What we saw, for example, in the debates over, post October 7th events and the war in Gaza, Hamas and Israel, what we saw was on most college campuses, one perspective was considered the correct perspective. And if you held another perspective than that, or if you even challenged certain tenets of that perspective, you could, run into trouble. So it is a problem. It's maybe not as, it's more complicated. It's not as monolithic. It's not as black and white as it's portrayed in the media. But I do think it is a challenge.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that exists. And you mentioned earlier the impact of social media, or how that has probably intensified this.
Absolutely.
And the reaction time and all those things. Is that a major player?
Totally.
In the speed of all this.
Absolutely it is. I mean, social media has been really, if you use it the way you and I probably do, which is mostly like, happy photos of things you're doing and looking at your grandkids.
Like this, love this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
just then but it can be a real problem. And we have more and more data now that for young women in particular, teenage girls, young women, it's especially a problem. Mm. There's a tendency for lots of reasons. I could go into all of that. A friend of mine and colleague, Jonathan Haidt, at New York University, NYU, he's sort of leads the charge in this regard, has a new book about this, and fascinating work. And,
a scary book.
Yeah, the Anxious Generation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was following up on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Incidentally, he was year before last our commencement speaker here at UNE. Like I said, he's a friend of mine. He's a great guy. So anyway, social media is a huge problem. We're never going to put the genie back in the box. Mm. It is what it is. But I think what we can do, I'm really heartened to see that schools are now not allowing kids to have their phones during the school day. I think that's brilliant. I think it's fantastic. I'm hoping that over time we'll settle into a better place and people will learn to self-limit their social media use. But it's hard. It's very addictive. Literally addictive.
Yeah. It's going to be a generational thing, I think, with that. Our generation, here are these devices, no instructions. They're going to run your life, but we didn't know that until it happened. Yeah. And when you look at the next generation, there's a little more control.
Well, I don't know. I hope so.
I hope so.
Let's hope.
Yeah, let's
hope that they develop more control. But the worst social media platforms, the very worst one, I'm sure there's some that are really horrible, but I'm talking about the worst mainstream ones. Have you ever heard of something called Yik Yak?
No.
Yik Yak is anonymous. So, and it's local to each, and it's colleges and universities, but it's local to that community. So there's a UNE Yik Yak, and it's completely anonymous. And so you can imagine an anonymity, what people post, completely anonymous. And they just post nasty things. So apparently, I'm told UNE's Yik Yak is not nearly as nasty as most colleges, but it's still not a pleasant place. And boy, I would love to just whoever owns Yik Yak to just pull the plug on that. But, so yeah, the mix of anonymity is, when you add that into the mix of social media, it's not a good thing.
Yeah. So that makes me think of this question that what I really walked away from last night in my own mind was not just the liberal perspective in college, almost any topic or anything. When I don't agree, I choose not to engage oftentimes. That's my sort of format. Yeah. But how do we change that so that you can have either a conversation? I guess more so, how do you have a belief and stand up for your belief without ending up on the dark list?
It's a great question. I think, and I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers, but if I could allow a few insights or just share a few thoughts. The first is, I think we would all do well to be a little more humble about our own beliefs, to hold our own beliefs a little more lightly. And when I'm talking beliefs here, I'm not talking about, the sort of core fundamental core values that you have, like religious beliefs, things like that. I'm talking about things like policy questions, for example. Rather than assuming that there's a right and a wrong answer, you may lean towards a certain perspective, but hold that tentatively and be open to listening, genuinely listening to the other side, other arguments, and to really considering it. Too often what people do is they don't really listen, and articulating your position, refining your beliefs starts with listening, and to the other side with an open mind. What people tend to do is they listen just long enough to hear what you're saying so that they then start formulating their arguments in their heads, so that the next little pause in the conversation, boom, they can fire with their counter arguments. I've done that. You've done that. I mean, it's natural. But if you stop and you really listen openly to what the other side is and consider it. Now, that doesn't mean that you may disagree even more once you've understood the other side, and that's fine too, but at least you better understand the other side. So even if it strengthens your own belief that you started with, you can now at least better defend it, better articulate the reasons for your belief, right? As opposed to just saying, well, I believe it. I don't know why. And that, I think that, and then finding ways of building communities where there's trust that you can speak up without being vilified. That's the second part of it. And the other part, and these aren't in any particular order, is recognizing that very rarely are things black and white. The world is nuanced and complicated, and our job is to explore those interesting nuances and complexities. Unfortunately, and this we could go down a whole other rabbit hole about this, but within the academy, for the past let's say 3 decades, there's been a growing movement, and it goes by different names: critical theory, postmodernism. But basically the idea in a nutshell is that, and it's more complicated than this, but I'm just going to give in the nutshell, is that there is no such thing as truth, objective truth. That it's not like there are true facts. Rather, what we call truth devolves into power. It's basically all about power. Who the person or the entity that's in power determines what is considered true, right? And so that leads to some really interesting, if you kind of follow that logic along the way, it leads to interesting places, as opposed to the traditional Enlightenment way of thinking, which is there is truth out there in nature to be discovered, and our job is to discover it, but all of us have our biases, our lenses, and so it's through the process of discourse and back and forth that we get closer to modeling, to seeing the way the world is out there. That's the more traditional Enlightenment perspective. And so what this leads to is basically an idea that the world is, and I mean, we could walk through how it gets there, but where you end up with is the idea that the world is pretty much black and white. It's oppressor, oppressed, good, bad, north, south, rich, poor. There's this dichotomy, and you take that template and you impose it on any particular issue. Take the Israeli Palestinian conflict, a very complicated conflict, very, very complicated, and with a long and complex history. No matter what side you're on of that, it is really complicated. But the way it's viewed often, not just on college campuses, but in the media and elsewhere, is it's very simple. You've got a good side and a bad side, and depending on what your tribe is, who you pick is the good and bad, but it's all sort of cut and dry. In fact, it's not. It's much more complicated than that. So we need to create spaces where people explore those nuances, those complications, from a perspective of curiosity and humility, not assuming that you've got all the right answers. And what comes with that is also a willingness to change your mind. Here's a fun trick to do, like a cocktail party trick. Yeah. Ask somebody, tell me 2 things in the past year that you've changed your mind about, and not just what your favorite ice cream is, right? But something of substance. Or how about 1 thing in the past year? Or how about 1 thing in the past 5 years? You'd be shocked at how few people can actually articulate something. But shouldn't we all be changing our mind in the light of either new data, new information, or better arguments or understanding from those data? We should be changing our minds. And yet people don't. They tend to get locked into a perspective. So we need to be able to create environments where it's safe to actually have that conversation, and and to do it from a perspective of curiosity, humility. Yeah. And now how to do that, I don't know, but we're trying. That's what the whole marketplace of ideas and everything is, to trying to do exactly that.
Yeah. Humility would go a long ways. Yeah. One of the interesting things that I heard last night was one of the professors who talked about his students, and he would ask for a paper, and they would write the paper with the intention of meeting his ideals,
right?
Because they felt they would do better maybe on the paper. Was that the
exactly?
Gist of it?
That he's, what he was arguing is that he's noticed a pattern where his students will try to figure out what his perspective on an issue is, and then to feed that to him, thinking that would get them a better grade. Mm-hmm. And of course, he was saying no, not at all. He wants to hear how good their arguments are, which is great. I think that's what professors should be doing. But I suppose that's a natural human nature, right? If you're a student, try to please the boss, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting stuff. It's, I wish there were some easy solution. I think it's going to require a lot of hard work and intentionality, and I'm not the only one. There are groups of faculty, of college administrators around the country who are trying to be much more intentional about promoting the idea that we really ought to be, doing what we're talking about, is having these really hard conversations without and welcoming a wider perspective of views. You can think about really anything that touches race relations. Think about affirmative action, for example. There are many people on college campuses don't even question the idea that affirmative action is a necessary good. And there's really good arguments to be made for affirmative action in things like college admissions or hiring decisions. Even now in 2025, there are good arguments, but there's also good arguments being made, including by Black scholars, like prominent Black scholars, that affirmative action causes more harm than good. And so what I'm interested in is not going in with proving one or the other side of that right, but really hearing the best arguments for both sides, and the contextualized arguments, like maybe in some cases it's necessary, in some cases not, maybe never, maybe always, but let's hear that and engage in that dialogue to better understand the issues.
Great. There was something mentioned, it might have been you, but someone said education should be uncomfortable, which I thought was a great comment. And when you think about it, you're a high school student, now you're a college student, it's a time when there are a lot of questions. A lot of answers are being given or options, and an uncomfortable time, I think, for you to sort things through and learn how to make decisions on your own.
I couldn't agree more, Rick, that there's a notion, it's sometimes called safetyism. And safetyism is this idea that you've probably heard of the notion of safe spaces, right? This is a safe space. So I think that's really misguided. Universities should be, like the rest of society, but especially universities, places that are absolutely safe spaces when it comes to physical violence, physical integrity. There should be zero tolerance whatsoever for physical threats of any kind, or for real intimidation and harassment, right? Safe from that. But they should absolutely not be safe for psychologically safe or emotional, like that you should always feel comfortable. You should feel uncomfortable. The whole idea, when you get confronted with some ideas that challenge a belief that you've had for a long time, that's going to be uncomfortable. And that's what we're shooting for. We want that. So our job should be to train students to help students become more resilient, to be able to be more tolerant of that discomfort so that they can dive in there. Because if you confuse physical safety with psychological, quote, safety or comfort, then that's, you're going to only want to hear ideas that can, you're not going to want to hear challenges. And that's not a healthy place to be, right? So we should be focused on helping students embrace that discomfort. I don't know about you, but with me, if I read a book, a nonfiction book about some topic, if it just presents all the arguments that I already agree with, it's kind of boring.
Mhm.
It's like, all right, that's fine.
Mhm.
But if I read a book that really challenges me, that presents really strong arguments or data that go against what I believed when I opened the book to begin with, that's where the fun is. It's uncomfortable, but that's where you learn. That's where the growth is. And if we're all about, as you said, having a time of growth, part of that growth, it doesn't just mean learning how to kayak if you didn't know how or whatever. That's all cool too. But it also means learning to be challenged, and have your core beliefs challenged. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
There were some terms used last night that I found fascinating. You discussed critical discourse, diversity of thought,
ideas,
of
diversity
ideas of thought,
yeah.
And speech code.
Oh yeah.
Tell me what for the uneducated or non university type.
Remember, we academics love making up these fancy, you mentioned pedagogy before, we can't just say
I didn't mention I couldn't say it.
So we can't, if there's an easy way to say something, well, then we have to invent a fancy word to make it sound esoteric or something. That's part of the university, I suppose, the culture. So the idea of diversity, ideological diversity, basically, is the idea that what we were talking about before, in fact, people who, on the political spectrum, people who tend to have different ideas, they don't all share the same assumptions or share the same biases. That would be your sort of ideological diversity. So like in any marketplace, right? If you go to a marketplace, a normal, I know you're from the Bath area, and there's a cool farmer's market in the summer there. If you go to the farmer's market and there's wonderful tomatoes, but that's all they have is nothing but tomatoes, right? And in fact, just one kind of tomato. And they're like some heirloom, Brandywine, great tomato, but that's all they have. Not a terribly interesting marketplace, right? Especially if you go back week after week and that's all they got is same tomatoes, right? So you want a variety of options on the menu. And it's the same with ideas. You want to have a lot of different ideas, a lot of biases, a lot of perspectives, and then mix them all together and sort through them. And that's where you get closer to knowledge, or to truth, if you will. So that's the idea of ideological diversity. Speech codes. So many campuses have developed in an effort to try to make, and this is with good intentions. So I want to be clear. This is not people trying to be overly censorious, trying to just, tell people what they can't say, to control their thought police. That's not the intention. The intention is to make everybody feel comfortable. Back to that comfortable thing. The theory being that if you feel more comfortable, you'll be more willing to participate and feel that you belong, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's some truth to that. But one way you do that is you design codes of speech that say, on this campus at this university, you can't say these things, you must say those things, and what speech is allowed and what's not. And a lot of the problem with these codes is that they put the onus on the speaker to figure out how not to give offense. In other words, if we're talking and you take offense at something that I say, then I'm the one in trouble. I've violated the speech code because I've offended you, right? But you're putting the power there in the hands of the listener to interpret. But think about how that could go wrong, right? Maybe you're wearing a black sweater, and what if I don't like black sweaters and that offends me? And I say, I'm offended by your sweater. Well, that's my problem, not yours. But yet now it becomes your problem. You see what I'm saying? So it gets really tricky. So the problem with speech codes is that they can have a chilling effect, because then people censor themselves. Even if they don't commit the violation of saying the wrong word or something, they are afraid to speak up. And that's exactly what's happened. The students and those surveys I reported have said that they're afraid often of speaking their mind about something because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. So now that doesn't mean that we have zero speech codes at all. The First Amendment, even free speech, has its limitations, right? It's not as though it's people who talk about being First Amendment purists. There's no such thing. The whole yelling fire in a crowded theater, for example. I mean, there's, slander, libel, there's all kinds of ways in which speech, has to be limited, but we should always err on the side of allowing more speech rather than less. That should be our prevailing principle. And speech codes, you have to be very careful because they can impede on that. So I'm not saying there should be no guardrails at all, but the guardrails should be pretty wide. And in many campuses, they become much too narrow.
Yeah. Speech codes, it was a word or phrase that I hadn't heard before, but it certainly applies.
Yeah.
Outside of the universities.
Oh, absolutely.
Applies everywhere.
Yeah.
For sure. Also thinking about fixing the problem, any thoughts about, you've touched on it some, but going into the future in the next 5 years, how does this change, get better, stay the same? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think there is a growing recognition in society as a whole, and even within universities, that the attempts to restrict discourse and speech went too far. Following 2020, 2022, in that period, post George Floyd, during COVID, that things went too far. And I think now the pendulum is swinging back, and that's a good thing, to provide more balance and more space. But I do think we need to be more intentional. But I do think people are talking about it now, being more intentional about creating cultures where people can have where robust discourse, but respectful. I say robust discourse, but civil, respectful discourse is encouraged. And I think we have to be intentional about that. So as I mentioned, this project that we're doing is one of those. And there's a variety of organizations that have popped up. Something called the Heterodox Academy is one that have popped up that are encouraging professors, encouraging university administrators like myself to build such programs like the ones that we're doing. So there is a movement afoot, I think, happening that way. Unfortunately, I think in the popular press, in the popular media, it's not happening yet. You have hyper-partisan cable TV news shows, and you have people who watch one or the other 24/7, and it just, you're living in a real bubble. And essentially what you could say we're trying to do here is to pop that bubble, is to expose people to ideas. But if you just watch one of those news shows all the time, 24/7, and you're just getting fed with this stream, you end up living in an alternate reality, just disconnected from other facts. And by the way, that happens on both sides. I'm not just picking on any one side. So I think we have to be intentional about it. Hopefully the efforts in the academy at universities will then help the rest of society adapt to more constructive discourse, so that instead of being, as many people view us, the source of the problem, we can become part of the solution.
Do you think that the media, which is changing, the go-to media sources are rapidly changing from 3 channels on TV, maybe we had 4 when we were younger, to the
Walter Cronkite, right?
Walter Cronkite.
Right. Yeah.
You could trust Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, that's right.
What he was saying was, came from the right place. And now we have so many sources. Yeah. That, I think, would you agree, is going to have a huge impact, and impact, and
already has.
Yeah.
I mean, it clearly has. Our society has become so divisive, and I think that 24/7 cable news media is a huge part of the problem. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I'm not sure how you change that, other than trying to get people to diversify their menu, their diet of news. So don't get all your news from one source, and read more than you watch on TV. Right. Read more than you watch, and if you're going to watch, then make sure you're watching a variety of sources so you're hearing different perspectives. Because so much of the news, not only the news itself is slanted in one direction or another, but it's so much commentary that you're missing the news.
And match that with the fact that we've become a world where we're so emotionally tied, invested in what we're hearing and how we're receiving it, and how we then deal with that we're yelling at the television.
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
screen in our house because
Well,
of something that somebody said.
Yeah, and there's a number of factors there. I think a couple of them. One, there's just a coarsening of discourse. You know, people, it didn't used to be like when I was growing up, and we're probably around the same age. So it didn't used to be that it was okay to just be quite so, especially in polite company on television or something, to just, you know, call people names and curse at them and stuff. There was, you know, so things were just less coarse in that sense. I think another big piece of it, and we touched on this a minute ago, is that back in the day, we shared a sense of the same basic facts, different people of different political persuasions, but then their interpretations of those facts would be different, right? So you'd watch Walter Cronkite, he would present the news. Now, never mind if that was actually itself biased, right? That's a whole nother conversation, but at least one way or another, we would share the same basic facts on the ground, and then our interpretations of those, what we did with those might be different. Now, if you're watching cable news, hyper-partisan cable news on either side, you are literally, the facts that you're hearing are different. So we don't share even a common set of a starting ground of facts. You know, on one side, you're being told certain things that this is true, and the other side you're being told something completely different. And so it creates a sense of like, these crazy people, they understand, like there's this thing going on. And it's, you know, you take the January, the elections, the January 6 events, right? The 2020 elections. There are people who have a whole set of facts about that, and they're genuinely baffled at why the other side doesn't see it the way they do. And so therefore they must be either really ignorant or really out of touch, you know, or really evil. So that's a problem. And the only way, you know, it would be nice if we could say, get all the cable news media to be less partisan and be more balanced, and, you know, but yeah, that's not going to happen, because that's not the way you get more viewers and, you know, make more money. But what we can try to do is to help citizens understand that the world is complicated, and so they need to take it upon themselves to diversify their diet of media.
If we could, I would love to hear a little bit more about your work in the treatment of mood and anxiety disorders.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk for hours on that. I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
So the work I've done, let me back up. Most people who have a clinical depression or a clinically significant anxiety problem, whether that's obsessive compulsive disorder or panic attacks or social anxiety, whatever, the single most common treatment is medications, right? And medications can have a place. That, don't get me wrong, sometimes they're necessary, sometimes they can be helpful, but there are also behavioral treatments. So fairly short-term intensive psychotherapies, behavioral treatments, cognitive behavior therapy, you may have heard of this, that can be just as effective as medication, and in fact, even more so in the long run. The problem with the medications is, as a general rule, when you stop taking them, the problem comes back, right? So you're suppressing the problem. It's not like an antibiotic where it gets rid of the problem. Psychotropic medications. But these behavioral treatments tend to have long-lasting impacts, but they're not perfect. And so part of what I was trying to do is to figure out, when I was actively doing a lot of research in this area, how do we make those treatments more accessible and better? So we were early adopters on the more accessible side. We were early adopters of telehealth, teletherapy before COVID, way before COVID actually, and did some of the early experiments in using that, showing that it was surprisingly effective. It actually surprised me. I was not expecting telehealth using an early version of Skype, basically. I was not expecting it to work as well as it did. So that was interesting. But the other thing is, a lot of my work was using mindfulness techniques borrowed from, like Buddhist traditions and Hindu traditions, using some of those techniques and incorporating them into traditional cognitive behavior therapy to see if we could make the treatments more effective. So, and we did that with anxiety disorders, but we expanded it to other kinds of things as well. So, weight control was one, people on diets. Probably some of the most interesting studies were on psychosis. like schizophrenia, when people are having delusions and hallucinations. Did you remember that movie, A Beautiful Mind?
Sure.
Did you see that?
Yes.
So remember the guy, the main character, was having these hallucinations and thinking that a little girl and then his college roommate were with him and telling him to do things and harassing him all the time and all of that. And he fought that for most of his life. And at the very end, if you remember what happened, is he decided to make peace with those hallucinations. And he told them, like, I'm not going to pay attention to you anymore. I can't get rid of you. You're here. I know you're here, but I'm going to stop talking to you. And they, of course, didn't like that. But that movie, I thought, did a brilliant job of portraying what it's like to actually be psychotic, because you can't tell. Like, I could be talking to you right now and you look like you're sitting there and you're real, but yet you're not. And so if you're suffering from that condition, it's hard to know what's real and what's not. And especially when those voices are telling you very negative things, you can see how upsetting that would be. But he made peace by finally getting to the point that he stopped pushing back on them and just let them be, but he didn't engage with them. And over time, they didn't completely leave, but the voices weren't as loud anymore. So that's what we tried to teach people to do. We would try to teach them to not fight their hallucinations, but don't engage with them. Just let them be there and focus instead on doing the things they need to do to live their life. And what we found was pretty dramatic. We found that we took inpatients that were experiencing acute psychosis, gave them 3 sessions of this mindfulness-oriented treatment. We reduced rehospitalization rates over the subsequent months by something like 38%, just with 3 sessions of that training. Wow. So it's pretty dramatic. And so similarly with obsessive compulsive disorder, with eating, cravings, instead of fighting the craving, if you just notice it and sort of try to learn how to just be with it, notice it, not try to make it go away, that's actually a much more effective way of dealing with it than trying to suppress it or fight it. So and so that the work we did in that, and I was just one cog in the wheel, many other people doing great work in this area, but it had an impact. And so the best current therapies, behavioral therapies for many of these disorders, more and more now incorporate this element of mindfulness in them. So, yeah.
The mind is a magical thing.
Oh, yeah. Magical in both ways. It can be, our thoughts, our verbal abilities they're the reason that we are such amazing problem solvers and we can send people to the moon and all the rest, but they're also the source of a lot of our problems.
Yes.
So
well said. Well said. Well, James, I can't thank you enough.
It has been a blast, Rick. It's such a pleasure sitting down with you. So thanks for making the time to come out to my office.
It was a real struggle to get here and spend some time on the water.
On the water, yeah. Well, I tell you what, I've been out on your beautiful boat, and that's that spot there on the Kennebec is where you live and work. Is you talk about magical? Love it up there.
I'm a lucky man.
So you are.
How would people best learn more about President's Forum?
Sure,
Dr.
absolutely.
James Herbert, University of New England.
Well, if you go to the UNE website, une.edu, and just probably the easiest thing is type in the search bar either Marketplace of Ideas or President's Forum, and these things come up. And all of these events are open to the public. We have lectures at least monthly. These President's Forums we have at least once a semester. They're free and open to the public, and we would love to have people come and join us. There's also on the Marketplace of Ideas webpage, there's resources for some of the stuff that we were talking about today. So people who are interested can dig down more and find links and resources to various talks and things like that.
Great. We'll make show notes that will make those available to people. So thank you so very much for that.
Yeah.
So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Benjamin, very much for getting us set up down here remotely. We appreciate it. And until the next time, have a great day.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you.